This is the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm Dave Reed. In this episode, we have two interviews from our U.S. correspondent, Michael Arria. First, Michael talks to Ryan Grimm, Washington, D.C. bureau chief for The Intercept. Ryan has a new book out titled The Squad, AOC and the Hope of a Political Revolution. In it, he reports on the fight between the squad of progressive Democrats first elected to Congress in 2018 and Israel lobby organizations AIPAC and Democratic Majority for Israel. Later, we'll hear from a student organizer at Columbia University about that school's suspension of pro-Palestine groups on campus. Here's Michael's conversation with Ryan Grimm.
Thanks for joining us, Ryan. To start, I wanted to ask a question connected to current events. Obviously, you wrote this book before the events of October 7th and subsequent assault on Gaza by Israel. I'm wondering what you've made of the squad and, for that matter, the larger progressive constituency in Congress. Their reaction to the assault on Gaza. Has anything stood out to you? Has anything surprised you about their reaction?
I've talked to a couple people who were involved in the early founding of Justice Democrats, which helped to create the squad. And one of them said, this is the first time in a very long time that I've been proud of what I did. You've kind of seen a coming to fruition of the idea that there needs to be a faction within the Democratic Party that speaks with moral courage and gives voice to, part of the Democratic coalition that represents tens of millions of people, yet their representation inside the party doesn't translate into numbers inside the House. Like, one of the things that struck me was this visual of a vigil that was held on behalf of both Palestinian civilian lives and Israeli civilian lives. It was held on the Capitol steps. And previously there had been a vigil for Israeli civilian lives lost. And the number of representatives at the Israeli lives vigil were countless. Like, it seemed like everyone practically, in Congress was there. The steps were overflowing. At the Palestinian and Israeli lives lost vigil, looked like you had about 9 people. And so the stark difference there, when compared to the kind of street protests that we've seen in the US and around the world, kind of showed how kind of upside down Washington is when it comes to this issue. You have, overwhelming opposition to what's going on in Gaza, yet overwhelming support in our allegedly representative institutions.
I wanted to talk about Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. She's, the most prominent figure in your book. She's in the title. She's kind of, I think many people see her as kind of the face of the progressive movement in Congress that kind of grew out of the first Bernie campaign. She's criticized consistently by the right, obviously, and by pro-Israel groups for allegedly being anti-Israel. She's also criticized sometimes, I'd say, from the left for maybe being more nuanced when it comes to this issue than her colleagues like, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, others. You write in your book, you have a whole section about her present vote on the Iron Dome funding from a couple years ago. How would you assess her approach? Do you believe that she's been more nuanced, and what would you attribute that to compared to her colleagues?
I mean, I think she too would cop to that. She'd be like, yes, I think that's a fair assessment. The Iron Dome vote was interesting in the way that, if you remember, she changed her vote from no to present. And the way she explained it afterwards was that she felt like that if she had voted no on that one, which was a gotcha vote, like it was a round number, $1 billion aimed at replenishing the Iron Dome. It never went through Congress. Like, it wasn't going to go through the Senate. It was just symbolism. It might as well have been a resolution. It's one of the many resolutions that we put on the floor lately. But she felt that if she voted against it, she would be seen as a pariah in synagogues throughout her district and also among kind of supporters of Israel, and would then be unable to help, bridge the divide between pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli, constituents in her district. Like, that she saw her role as, on the one hand, standing up for, Palestinian rights, and as part of that role, using her position to get to some type of peaceful resolution at the end. And that's a very difficult dual role to play, to be at once kind of the rabble-rouser, the radical, the outsider, but also want to be the person who's going to bring people together. And, she wants to be that figure. And I think that's where people see the nuance that you were talking about.
The Intercept recently ran an excerpt from your book about how Israel lobbying groups moved to purge critics of the country from the Democratic Party. There's a recent piece in Slate also, which reports that AIPAC is about to spend potentially $100 million to unseat Israel critics in 2024. Can you talk a little about the impact that we've seen groups like AIPAC and DMFI have had on the Democratic Party, and how has that impact also altered the squad's strategy and spending?
Yeah, and as I write about in the book, it's interesting when you go back and retrace it, because you couldn't quite see where it was heading. You sort of could see where it was heading, but not quite in the very beginning. At DMFI, which is kind of almost a spin-off of AIPAC, it was founded by Mark Mellman, who's a consultant to Yair Lapid, the leader of the Yesh Atid party in Israel. So kind of wearing multiple hats there. He's also an AIPAC consultant who led the campaign against the Iran deal, for instance. So he spins up in January 2019 Democratic Majority for Israel, which was a kind of explicitly a response to Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar getting sworn into Congress. And now you're going to have two Muslim women who are articulate critics of Israel and are creating space within a Democratic Party that for the last roughly decade had some space for criticism, with J Street, which is a kind of liberal Zionist progressive alternative to AIPAC, which would defend Democratic critics of Israel when they were charged with being anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. J Street would say, no, it's okay to criticize the occupation. It's okay to, And so this is a very gradual move, but they saw this as a huge problem, that now we're going to have, serious critics of Israel, inside the Democratic Party at a time where Democrats were increasingly and are increasingly, paying attention to marginalized communities and respecting people for, their lives, their stories, and their identities. And so to have a Palestinian American woman in the House talking to her colleagues about her experience and her family's experience under occupation, represents a real threat. So they spin up DMFI. Their first candidate they go after actually is Bernie Sanders in the presidential campaign. After that, they spent millions against Jamal Bowman trying to prevent him from beating Eliot Engel, the extremely hawkish chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And Bowman beats him anyway. And so the next cycle, after the Gaza war, of 2021, where you have a parade of Democrats coming to the House floor, not just the squad, but lots of other Democrats coming to the House floor and criticizing Israel in the middle of the war. It's something that had really never happened before in the House. That's when AIPAC decides, they need to go in big and start purging critics of Israel. They went after not just the squad and its adjacent folks, but they spent big against Andy Levin, for instance. You might remember that race. Andy Levin was one of the most pro-labor members of Congress from a famous kind of Michigan family, the Levins, Carl Levin, Sandy Levin. He was a synagogue president, and he would call himself a proud Zionist, but he was heavily critical of Israel, and he would defend Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. And AIPAC said that his credibility and his willingness to defend Tlaib and Omar meant that he needed to go. So they took him out and also went after any kind of progressive primary where it looked like the progressive in the race might have some sympathies for Palestinian rights. And what they would do is they would either heavily finance the kind of center-left candidate, or they would speak with the progressive candidate enough and get them to, write down a Israel-Palestine policy that they were comfortable with. And then in exchange, they would stay out of those races. And so that really, altered what progressive candidates believed was possible to say when it came to Israel-Palestine. And you'd have tons of candidates who would say, oh, it looks like AIPAC or DMFI are looking at this race. Let's hurry up and put out an I support Israel tweet. Let's get a policy platform together that heads off that challenge, because so many of these Democrats don't see this conflict as kind of central to what they're trying to accomplish in Congress. They want to reverse climate change. They want to mitigate against it. They want Medicare for all. They want a higher minimum wage. They want higher union density. The broad kind of progressive agenda. And they would argue that I can't accomplish any of that if I get knocked out because of this.
There's a new poll from Data for Progress It says that 76% of Democratic voters now support a ceasefire. We've seen multiple surveys with similar numbers. And these kind of polls really aren't surprising, I think, to people who have been following polling on this issue in recent years. It's something we cover at the site quite a bit. The reputation of Israel has obviously declined among Democratic voters and progressives, particularly young ones. It's funny, we were talking about DMFI. I was just thinking of how groups like that, when they run ads against Democratic challengers or incumbents, they don't actually mention Israel in their ads because they know it's
right. When they ran against Bernie, he had a heart attack and therefore he can't beat Trump.
right. Yeah. So, connected to that, there's clearly this disconnect between the voters and their elected representatives. So I'm just wondering, there's still a very small amount of Congress members in the scheme of things who stand up for Palestine, who criticize Israel. What do you attribute that disconnect to? Is it merely that politicians don't want to get targeted by these lobbying groups, or do you think there's deeper things going on there?
No, I think it's mostly the not wanting to get targeted, because taking the wrong position and having a DMFI or AIPAC spend several $1 million against you can end your career. Taking the other position, doesn't come with a lot of upside. Like, there's not a huge organized kind of Arab American AIPAC type institution that's going to, be able to push back against that. There isn't a kind of broad kind of international pro-peace organization. Like, there's no kind of political counterweight. So, I read about this in the book, that in 2022, Justice Democrats and J Street primarily, and they teamed up with Working Families Party, Indivisible, and some other progressive organizations, and they sifted through the 2020 campaign, saw the rise of DMFI, and they said, okay, like, there needs to be a well-funded counterweight to this. Like, we can't get caught off guard in 2022. And they expected DMFI would be able to spend maybe $5 to $10 million in the 22 cycle. And so J Street put together, $2 or $3 million. Working Families Party and Justice Democrats came in with another couple million. And they figured, if we're outspent 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, we can compete, because all the polling shows that our positions, not just on Israel Palestine, but in general, are more popular than the center left candidate's position. So you can win with less money. You need to be able to stay in the game. And so they were ready for that onslaught in 2022. But then AIPAC comes in with its almost unlimited money, $30 to $40 million spent. And so that just completely changes the game. That let them spend, for instance, they spent $7 million in a Prince George's County congressional race against Donna Edwards, because she had voted the wrong way on a Gaza war vote in 2008. And she was running to kind of get her seat back after many years. They spent, I think, $6-7 million against Nida Alam down in North Carolina, just absolute huge amounts of money. And so what the coalition eventually figured out was that if they got outspent, more than 5 to 1, then they would lose. If it was only 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, then they had a good chance to win.
So finally, I know it's tough to project what's going to happen in U.S. politics, obviously, probably a futile task. But I'm wondering, you've seen these kind of terrible polling numbers for Biden's reelection. And, we already talked about the amount of money that pro-Israel lobbying groups are prepared to spend against the Squad and other, incumbents who are critical of Israel. I'm wondering what you believe the shift in terms of the Democratic Party might be going forward as a result of the Squad. And do you see the Squad expanding potentially in 2024 as it has in other elections, despite these, grisly poll numbers and the lobbying? I know someone like Ilhan Omar, for instance, I think her last election was so much closer than people envisioned.
Right. People including her.
Yeah, totally. So, and I know like AIPAC and other groups probably would have spent more if they knew it would have been close. They really sat that one out more or less. So I'm wondering what you've seen so far when it comes to the election next year.
The Squad itself is, there are a lot of them that are underdogs in their races going into them. I think, Cori Bush is currently an underdog against Wesley Bell. Jamal Bowman may be considered an underdog against George Latimer in his race. Like you said, Ilhan Omar squeaked by, but this time she's not going to take it for granted. And her opposition is a bit more divided. Last time it was a one-on-one race. I think Rashida Tlaib, actually, despite being the one that they seem to want to knock out more than any other, is nobody's safe. But so far, they haven't managed to find a candidate, despite 2 different people in Michigan saying that they were offered $20 million to drop out of their current races and run against Rashida Tlaib. In order to beat her, they would have to take positions that would be deeply unpopular, in her district. So it's going to be a challenge for them there. I think AOC and Ayan are both pretty safe. So I think also what the landscape looks like 6 months from now will be much different than today. So it's a little bit early to say. I think the catastrophe unfolding in Gaza, as horrific as it is now, may only be at the beginning. And you've been following this obviously very closely, but as like disease begins to take hold, and as the reality that the entire kind of civilian infrastructure has been annihilated, rendering the place uninhabitable. Now you've got seawater thrown on top of it. It raises the question of how people even survive here. And so, that catastrophe will also have a kind of dynamic effect on American politics here and how people's positions are viewed in retrospect.
Well, Ryan, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
In recent weeks, we've seen a disturbing wave of McCarthyism target Palestine activism across college campuses. A number of Students for Justice in Palestine chapters have been suspended or even banned at schools. One of the schools is Columbia University, which also suspended its Jewish Voice for Peace chapter. Michael spoke with a member of Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine about these developments. She's also a member of Columbia University Apartheid Divest, a coalition that has been relaunched in response to the suspensions. She asked Mondoweiss to withhold her name.
Okay, so to start, I wanted to talk about these two groups that were suspended on campus for the rest of the term. Can you talk about why they were allegedly suspended and also what you've learned about the process since that was announced?
Yeah, sure. So on November 10th, both Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace were suspended from campus on the grounds of unfairly applied and newly applied policy, both from pre-existing policy and from later changed policy. After some of our first demonstrations, the policy for clubs and student groups on campus in relation to public demonstrations and even hosting events on campus became very cutthroat and was very targeted at our student groups. It's important to note that the policy was changed on October 26th, and we have the evidence of every word that was changed in this policy. And kind of about what I've learned about the process since, I think this decision backfired on the university. We celebrate the revitalization of the Columbia Apartheid Divest Coalition as a victory from the suspension. We are extremely upset by the decisions of the university to follow through based on the demands of donors and people with funding. However, it's very obvious that these policies were unfairly applied specifically to groups that were organizing for Palestine. And one in specific that was applied unfairly to us was the 10-day policy to host outside events, which was before October 12th, which was our first demonstration. There were exceptions for crises and emergencies in the world. And this was why we were allowed to have our first protest on October 12th. Yet following the first protest and with the increasing thousands of Palestinians being killed every day, they neglected any kind of special exception for our groups to host demonstrations, even vigils for Palestinian lives on campus. And this made it very difficult for us to organize and left us with the decision of, do we want to have this protest in this moment? And will they be able to use this against us in the future? And ultimately, they were able to and were successful in kind of this larger campaign of suppression that ultimately culminated in suspending both student groups for the end of the semester.
So I wanted to talk about the actual formation of this coalition. I covered this story, I think, a couple of weeks ago when it first happened. And within 5 days, I think when I wrote the story, it was 40 groups, student groups, and within 5 or 6 days, it was over 80 student groups. Can you talk about how this coalition came together, who some of the groups involved are? And connected to that, it's also my understanding that this coalition existed in some form previously, kind of connected to a BDS resolution that had been voted on at the school. Can you talk about kind of that history as well?
Yeah, of course. So the Columbia University Apartheid Divest Coalition was formed in the spring semester of 2014 by SJP and JVP alums. It was formed and later used, this coalition, to, as you were mentioning, introduce the referendum to divest from Israeli apartheid and all companies that were complicit in Israeli apartheid. This referendum was introduced for the first time at this university in 2016 and was later voted on at Barnard College in 2018 and passed with a 2/3 majority, and later put to vote at Columbia College in 2020, which was also passed by the student body and later unilaterally overturned by President Bollinger at the time. And after the referendum was put down, the coalition disbanded, and it wasn't until the beginning of October 2023 when we began working very tightly with Jewish Voice for Peace that we brought back this coalition. And we began working also with other Palestine organizing groups on campus. And slowly but surely, many other organizations were reaching out and asking how they can help with this movement. And slowly, we began collaborating with these student groups. And it wasn't until the suspension that we formalized the coalition and announced the coalition in line with our mission statement and our demands, and had many student organizations sign on, and had the opportunity for other student organizations that had not yet signed on to sign on as they please. And like you mentioned, now we're up to about 85 plus organizations. So I will mention just a few of the organizations involved and kind of explain. So I wanted to start with, obviously, Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace. There is the Black Student Organization. They have been very vocal in this movement. Yesterday, I attended an event on Black Palestinian solidarity where I delivered a speech as well as a representative from Black Student Organization. This was held at the Malcolm X Center. This was just a very good event and kind of showed not only the community and the solidarity amongst Black students and Palestinian and pro-Palestinian students, but also in the larger Harlem community, and really the people in our community that are following this movement and who are backing the solidarity of Black Palestinian solidarity. I think it's important to note the historical perspective as well of Black Palestinian solidarity. Very iconic figures such as Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, etc., who have advocated for the Palestinian people and noted that there are similar struggles in the US for Black Americans against the American government. So that's kind of where they stand. Other student organizations that we have are the Barnard Columbia Abolition Collective, the Young Democratic Socialists of America, the Palestinian Students Union, the Somali Students Association, the Columbia Queer and Asian, the Columbia Queer Alliance. We have groups from Asian countries, Columbia Vietnamese Students Association, Tudath, which is the Arab Students Association, the Pakistani Students Association, Mixed Heritage Society, the Chicanx Caucus, Native American Council, Mujeres, which is for Latina women, and as well as the Columbia Review and some other publications that have vowed to signing on to this coalition and being an active member, including the Barnard College radio station known as WABAR or WBAR, and many other intersectional groups across all identities and mission statements that have come together and signaling to the administration and to the world and to the country that Students for Justice in Palestine is not a fringe group, emphasizing that countless student organizations across these missions that I mentioned remain dedicated to the cause against systems of oppression worldwide. And I believe that the administration's decision to follow through on our suspension has strengthened our presence as a movement on campus and has boosted solidarity.
So connected to that, I mean, something that's very compelling about this activism, I think, to a lot of people in the case of Columbia is this coalition, you are not just demanding that this ban on SJP and JVP be lifted. You have a list of additional demands that you're holding the school accountable for. Can you talk about what you're demanding from Columbia beyond those groups being reinstated?
Yes, of course. So I can go in order of the demands we have. So the first demand, which is more of a timely and more pressing demand that we decided collectively to put as the first one, which is for our administration to call on President Biden and New York senators and representatives and all other government officials to support an immediate ceasefire in Gaza in line with the demands of the majority of Americans. And I might not have mentioned this before, but these demands are directly to the university and more broadly to immediately divest all economic and academic stakes in Israeli apartheid in accordance with the results of the 2020 student body referendum. So the second demand is to divest from companies profiting from Israeli apartheid, noting that both former Columbia and Barnard presidents unilaterally and anti-democratically ignored the student body referendums to divest in 2020 and 2018. As I mentioned, this is kind of just bringing it back and again, notifying the university, although they are aware, notifying and reminding the university that the majority of the student bodies at both main colleges of this university were in support of it. And while some of these students may have passed and gone on to their lives beyond university, there is a new generation of us students, and hundreds of us have shown out. And we just like to emphasize this throughout. So the third demand is to cancel the opening of the Tel Aviv Global Center, noting that Palestinian affiliates of Columbia would be restricted from access to this program, given Israelis' apartheid policies, and therefore Columbia violates its own non-discrimination policy. The fourth demand is to seize the dual degree partnership with Tel Aviv University for the same reason. Number 5 is to stop repressing and vilifying pro-Palestinian activism and vigorously protect the academic freedom and right to political speech of students, staff, and faculty as they face McCarthyite smear campaigns. Accordingly, the university must change policy so that protests and events can be sanctioned within 3 days to allow students to organize under urgent circumstances such as the current Palestinian genocide. And last but not least is to reinstate, as you mentioned, Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace, and issue an official apology for their unjust suspension in violation of university procedure.
And have you gotten any reaction from the school regarding in the wake of the suspensions or connected to these demands that you listed?
That's actually a very interesting question because you might be surprised, but we've gotten almost no reaction from the school. We've heard no comments on the coalition or on the tens of student groups that have joined us in solidarity. I believe that this is definitely a moment of desperation for the university, and they were not expecting the coalition. They expected to suppress the movement as a whole on campus. And I can assume that they are working frantically, thinking of ways to suppress these student groups. But many of those that have signed on to the coalition are identity-based groups, and to suspend those groups would be absolutely ridiculous and absolutely neglecting not only their own history as people, both what comes to mind is the Black Student Organization and the Native American Council, but very, very tied histories, and they cannot suspend these groups. And we know this. And if they do go forward with any suspensions of other groups or any disciplinary action of other people in the coalition, we will know exactly why this is happening. But so far, there has been no reaction from the school. We asked follow-up questions in the original email that we were sent. I was sent personally, actually, to my personal student email notifying us of the suspension of our club. There was a part of the suspension that said, number 1, you held unsanctioned events. That we knew why this was being said. We knew how policies were being unfairly applied, but we knew why this was being said. However, the second one referred to us using threatening language. And we followed up on this and we replied to the dean that sent us this original email. And we have not heard back. We have gotten no clarification on why we were suspended or specifically what these specific words meant and why they were being used against us. We wanted to know what we were saying. We have been holding peaceful protests on campus, yet we are being subjugated to a level of suppression and defamation that no other organizing groups have faced in a decade at this school.
And finally, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the current environment and the situation at the school, kind of beyond this one instance. I've seen, reports of other examples of suppression of Palestine activism on campus. Can you talk about what challenges you're up against, not just as it relates to the administration, but maybe from other student groups, and just kind of what the overall environment is at Columbia currently for activists who are working on this issue?
So the current sentiment on campus towards Palestinian activism has become increasingly discriminatory and, might I add, violent. I think that at the beginning, the forces against us were acting out of desperation and fear that the truth was being revealed, and they resorted to disgusting tactics such as doxing and putting our personal information on public sites and putting our faces on trucks that drove around campus. Actually, the same trucks returned yesterday to campus. This is not old news. This is persisting. And not only are student groups on campus, such as Students Supporting Israel, have expressed support for some of these tactics, it becomes very scary as not only a student, but as an individual. Who can I trust on this campus? Who do I feel safe around, both physically and mentally? And then once we get into the administration's response, the sentiment has been awful. The president of Barnard College put out an email equating, actually, she said she was appalled to see anti-Zionism on campus. And so these administrators are honestly not even hiding what they really feel. And like historical movements for Black Lives Matter, et cetera, where administrators have had to conceal how they really feel to be appealing to a specific audience. Yet we find that they have no shame in admitting to the whole school that they have issue with students advocating for the liberation and for the rights of Palestinians. Not only the suspension, as I have talked about a few times, but also when we actually attempted to host our first teach-in, we had two guest speakers, one an outside of Columbia, one being a professor at Columbia. This event was shut down by the administration of Barnard, and we have not yet held a public event in a room in Columbia University since the beginning of the year. And obviously now we are not able to access booking rooms on campus, so SJP will not host any public events, but the coalition will. And we are fully behind every organization that hosts teach-ins, and we play a role in organizing some of these, and they are super important, but JVP is not allowed to access our funds, access booking rooms, and having space to even learn and speak with each other and have kind of a safe space for each other. The sentiment towards us as student groups do not even allow us to have a space to grieve together, to join together and kind of have this moment and come together to not only organize as thousands and thousands of people are being killed, but also just to teach other students and, have this duty as a club to spread our message to as many people that want to hear it. And we think that the administration has reacted so poorly to having a majority of their student body being in support of an activist movement, instead of emphasizing these voices and providing a platform and spaces on campus to hold political expression that is completely valid under our rights as students, our rights as individuals. They want to suppress our voices in every manner that they can. And this goes beyond just events, but psychological warfare, such as name dropping us in emails with very important administrators at the school, putting us in imminent danger and knowing the dangers of doing such actions, yet feeling so empowered by the rhetoric that is being thrown around American media, being thrown around administrators and donors and board of trustees. They feel completely empowered to act in such a way that if it was applied to any other group, this would never, ever fly.
Well, thanks so much for chatting with us today. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much.
That's our show. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the US and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.